Certainly, a nun dedicating her life to serving God and humanity is a noble calling. But is such a calling really based on a rational worldview? In the 1990s, I talked to and questioned several nuns. Sister Marie, 50 years a nun. The vow of obedience. In the classic movie, The Nun Story, very good movie, a nun is told by her superior to deliberately flunk a test in order to teach herself humility, even though she needed to pass the test to go on the hospital missionary work for which she was highly qualified.
Well, in those days, they were strong on what you call blind obedience.
Mm-hmm.
And that exactly was a case of blind obedience, where she would have to obey blindly, put her judgment aside, and go by. I don't agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would have had difficulty with it myself.
Yeah.
However, in those days, that's the way we obeyed it. But in today's society, that would not work at all.
Mm-hmm.
She would say no,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Because this blind obedience bit has gone out the window.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obedience is understood in a different way now. You know, it's not that you move because the Spirit tells you should move. Now it's more like we dialogue and we talk about it and we discern. We go through a spiritual discernment. So the Superior prays and I pray, and then we come together and we put the pros and the cons and we talk about it. So there's more dialogue now. Yeah. Because the vow of obedience, really now they say it's like a vow of listening.
Aha.
And it's not just me.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And it's not just me listening to my superior. It's my superior listening to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's the way it should be, because human beings are fallible, and so a blind obedience to a human being is a dangerous thing, very dangerous.
Although, what is it they used to tell us? Your superior may be wrong in ordering you to do certain things, but you will never be wrong by obeying.
Ooh. Now, what if you're in Nazi Germany, though? They were obeying. They were
obeying the orders.
Obeying orders.
And they all went on that. That's the excuse they gave. I was doing what I was told to do. And all that. But maybe they should have backed off.
Yeah.
Well, Sister Marie, you can't have it both ways. To never be wrong by following orders, and yet at the same time to be wrong by following orders. It always bothers me when religious people so readily ignore the law of non-contradiction and live as though something can be both true and not true at the same time in the same way. I think the Holocaust is very analogous to the Inquisition in that people obeyed the immoral orders of fallible human beings. Convent life, the concept of detachment.
Some of the little detailed things you have to do in your daily life. One thing that came up is you simply do not have mirrors in your room in order to prevent vanity.
That's not true. We do.
You do? Okay.
Well, in the past.
So a lot of these things are...
Yeah, in the past there were no mirrors. It's true. When I entered the convent, there were no mirrors.
Yeah.
There was a window that, I don't know, it was blocked somehow, and it was dark behind, so it served as a mirror. So we'd go by the... fix our coif and all that vanity, but then we had to accuse ourselves of having in vain. There were no mirrors. You're right. You're right. And all the windows of our convent were frosted. They frosted. We'd take white paint and cotton batting, and we'd frost all the windows so we would look out and they couldn't look in. And,
here's the thing that bothers me most about. See, I respect a person dedicating their life to a noble cause. Okay? But I object to some of the things involved. And one of the biggest things is the idea of detachment. That if you're supposed to love everybody equally, and so if you happen to make good friends with another nun or another person, you're supposed to fight against that.
We used to.
Because I think that's just an awful thing, that
Yeah,
you're not allowed to friendship in a sense.
Right. We were not allowed friendship. They used to call them particular friendships.
Yeah.
And they were taboo, you're right. But now, it's different. We do allow, they gave us courses and sessions on intimacy, which is linked with the vow of chastity and all that. And that it's okay to have friends. And in fact, it's good to have friends. Somebody that you can open up to and talk to might prevent you from having to go to a psychiatrist.
Yeah, right.
If you can speak to somebody who understands you and all that, and who loves you enough,
Yeah, so I would think that would
it's
be
not
very
the way.
so painful that
It was, it was bad. I have to admit, it was difficult, because if you did, I guess we didn't know then, but now that it's so open, this idea of lesbianism, we didn't know then, we didn't know the word, we didn't know that it existed, but I think that maybe the powers that be knew about it and were warding us or protecting us from that, because we could never go in a sister's room without permission and all that, and maybe it was a protection.
Yeah.
We try to figure it out sometimes, why it was.
The Inquisition.
Another big heavy issue is the Inquisition. See, for me, if I had to pick one issue that refutes the church to me, it would be the Inquisition. The church sponsored torturing of people, then I can't get around that at all and give my allegiance to such an organization. Because to me, such an organization could not possibly have been guided by God, the God that I know.
But see, God has given us free will. And so those Inquisition people thought they were doing the right thing. It was their judgment. One of those things in the church, a lot of things have happened in the church, and if you take church history and you read it, a lot of things have happened that we do not approve of. The only thing that we have to remember is that no matter how bad it was, how weak those people were representing the church, they have failed along the way, but the church has always gone through and is still the Church of Christ today and is still doing great work. Those are incidents along the way, but the church goes on. Christ said, I will be with you till the end of times, and he will be with the church till the end of times. So there'll be good priests and bad priests. There'll be good bishops and bad bishops. And there were good popes and bad popes.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty good defense, but the key thing is, these weren't just like individual bad apples. This was like church policy coming directly from the Pope. And if the Pope is divinely guided, then he never would have said this.
As I said, there were bad popes.
Bad popes. All right, well then...
And at one point there were two popes, right?
Right.
Remember?
So then, to what do you give your allegiance?
To God.
To God.
To God, who has never failed us, who always, we believe, that's what our faith is, that we believe in God and in his truth. Whatever he has told us is the truth, and he does what he says, he does what he promises, and his truth will go forever. And we give our allegiance to God and the truth. And
but if you had lived at that time, if you were a local...
I might have been confused.
You would have been part of that, because, gee, this is the church represented by the Pope, and this is what God wants, and yet it's not.
No, it's not necessarily what God wanted. Not
Yeah, so
necessarily.
did you see my viewpoint that I can't give my allegiance to such an organization?
Yeah. Yeah, I can see.
Yeah.
That's if you keep thinking of the human part.
Yeah.
But then
you...
if you give allegiance to God,
But is the church a human institution or is it a divine institution?
Oh.
If you say the church is a human institution, then I say I accept your defense.
Right.
but if you still claim it's a divine,
yeah.
then it's almost like meaningless. If it's divine, no matter what it does.
Despite my criticisms, I got the distinct impression that Sister Marie enjoyed this opportunity to discuss issues. And I have this theory. Many religious people like talking to me even though I'm opposed to their beliefs because I validate their doubts for them. They're not allowed to express their doubts. They are trapped in an ideological structure where their doubts are systematically suppressed. When I come along and discuss the issues and the holes in their belief system, it gives them a sense of vindication, the feeling that, there, see, my doubts are legitimate. Here's a man expressing them in much the same way as they occur to me. So talking to me gives them that satisfaction. But of course, that's as far as they go. They won't take the next step and give up their religion. I first noticed this behavior when I was in my 20s and was talking to a nun. She was telling me about a little kid in her third grade class who was the son of an atheist. The kid defiantly stood up to the parish priest and refused to do some religious thing. I don't remember just what it was, but it was something taking an anti-Catholic stand. And I was struck by how proud she was of the kid as she was telling me the story. She was practically beaming. And I thought to myself, doesn't she realize that in effect she is repudiating her own beliefs by being so proud of the kid? I think it was the same dynamic going on. The kid validated her doubts to her, and that made her feel good. Sister Eleanor, happy with convent life. Sister Eleanor does not find her life to be excessively controlled or regimented. There are definitely less restrictions for nuns these days. Most no longer wear a habit. The grand silence, a period of the day when you weren't supposed to talk, is no longer observed, at least not in her convent, and even back when it was not unreasonably rigid, according to her. Contrary to what I've read, she does not remember oppressive restrictions on how to walk, how to hold your hands, how to position yourself when sleeping, and so on. How a nun walks, or at least used to walk, is an interesting phenomenon to me. They were taught not to swing their arms, but to keep them very still. Now, that has a surprisingly dramatic effect. You are suddenly transformed from a normal person to a religious mystic, transfixed by a holy vision, floating, saint-like, above the temporal concerns of earthly life. You should try it. Get up and try walking that way yourself. You'll see what I mean. Sister Eleanor is not bothered by the problems and issues that bother me. Religious freedom.
My father was a Protestant. My mother was Catholic, so we were brought up as Catholics. Is that really religious freedom now? When the kids have to be brought up as Catholics? To me, it's more coercion. If the church taught that the kids of a mixed marriage have to be exposed to Catholicism, that would make sense to me. But if it says they have to be brought up Catholic, I think, to me, that's like a little violation of freedom, religious freedom.
Well, the freedom part was taken care of because when they, if I remember correctly, in those days they had to sign a paper that they would be brought up in the faith of the Catholic person. So they had a freedom to sign or not to sign that paper.
Yeah, well, they paid a heavy penalty, then they couldn't.
But they knew it. They knew it.
Don't you feel sorry then for what if the two people are in love and one is a strong Protestant?
One is a strong Catholic.
Yeah, then that marriage just does not happen because the guy or the woman doesn't want to sign that paper.
But if they did sign it, then they gave it freely. They weren't forced to do it.
Well, they were forced not to marry.
Well,
It's
that was their
basically saying you
option.
can't marry.
That was their option.
Ooh. But my real interest in asking that question though is where's the compassion for the two people?
That's their own freedom there.
My understanding is that even today, the kids of a mixed marriage must be brought up Catholic. To Sister Eleanor, this policy is an exercise in religious freedom, because the couple is free to choose not to marry. To me, such a policy is an exercise in religious coercion, not freedom. When people were burned at the stake during the Inquisition, was that likewise an exercise in religious freedom? They had a free choice to accept Catholicism or to be burned to death. We're not forcing them to be Catholics. They're perfectly free to be burned to death instead. Really? I mean, that is the logical extension of that kind of self-serving interpretation of freedom. Sister Helen, a liberal nun. The prohibition of second marriages.
The only way, logically, that it was ever explained to me that made sense is that, well, there are two different explanations, both of which I think are applicable. First of all, when the second coming of Jesus was written, they believed Jesus was coming tomorrow. I mean, like literally. The second coming of Jesus was around the corner, that they'd all be alive, da-da-da-da-da. And that a lot of those admonitions were made by a group of people who basically said, don't tangle your lives up. Don't remarry, don't do any of this stuff, just wait because everything's going to be all right, like tomorrow.
That might explain why marriage was not recommended, but it does not explain why remarriage would be condemned as adultery.
The other piece is that people lived to be an old man at the age of 40 and died in those days. So if you said to someone, I'm going to live with you and love you forever, you might be looking at a 10 or 15 year marriage. Human beings can deal with that. Wasn't a complex culture. Wasn't complex in terms of what we look at and live with today. And I think the church has, in some sense, has come to terms with that. In the sense that annulments are fairly easily obtained now. So people can remarry in the church and not have a problem. The church always arrives late and out of breath.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens. I mean, in my lifetime, you had to be a Kennedy or a Lennon sister way back in the 50s who had an in with the Pope to get a marriage fixed. I mean, in my lifetime now, 3/4, if not more, than my Catholic friends are in second marriages sanctioned and blessed by the church because they've set up a process. It takes the church a long time to say, I blew it. I mean, Galileo's a perfect example. 900
it was only
years
recently.
later. 900 years later, they go, well, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe gravity exists,
I don't buy Sister Helen's explanation for the prohibition of second marriages. If the Church's prohibition is based primarily on the temporal reasons she claimed, then the Church would have changed its policy by now, as it did for usury. But it has not. Jesus, the Bible, and the Catholic Church all present this prohibition as a divine edict, not as a culturally conditioned recommendation. Furthermore, Sister Helen is glossing over several critical factors. Number one, annulments are not that easy to get. 2, an annulment, dissolving a marriage that was invalid in the first place because of some serious misrepresentation, is not the same thing as a divorce, which is splitting up for whatever reason. And thirdly, the Church is not arriving late and out of breath in accepting second marriages. The Church does not accept second marriages. It continues to teach that remarriage is a grave sin. The Church as divinely guided.
Is the Church divinely guided in its moral decisions? Or is it supposed to be...
I think so. I do believe, I believe that the Spirit of God participates in those decisions, but I also believe that because human beings are involved in making laws and statements, that there's room for error. I mean, in the last 200 years, there are only two single things in the Roman Catholic Church that they've said are, quote, infallible. And none of them are moral. Absolutely none of them are moral. And I don't think there ever will be a moral statement that's declared infallible. I can't imagine that will happen.
So then the Church is divinely guided in esoteric doctrine?
In esoteric doctrine.
Because it's hard to determine whether it's true or not that Mary was conceived immaculately, or that she was assumed bodily into heaven.
Oh yeah, and some of that, see again, Mickey, some of that stuff is just a matter of faith and how you understand it. I can't explain those things to you, and I'm not going to say that I believe them literally, because you could pin me against the wall, and I probably would say, yeah, I don't believe them literally.
On being a modern nun.
And you grew up Catholic?
Mm-hmm.
And what did you find different than what you might have expected from being a nun?
I don't think absolutely anything, because I certainly was exposed to the lifestyle and people and, worked with people in religious communities all those years before then. So,
if your perception of what a nun life would be like turned out to be what you expect because you already knew it, how would you say it's different than what the general public thinks?
I think the general public is locked into that, to the old viewpoint.
Yeah.
I think, but basically, I think some of that is not understanding that changes took place, not liking that changes took place. I mean, it's 1995, and I still meet people who say, well, don't you think you should wear a habit? And I said, no, thank you very much.
Yeah.
If you'd like to wear one, fine. I can show you a costume place, and you can rent one, but, those habits were the dress of the day, and for very economical reasons, they didn't change them, and it just became literally a habit. And we walked into the 20th century. I never wore one, so.
Yeah, I know. I've met people who, you sometimes read in the paper, people get annoyed. They think we need to go back to
the old
solid values,
security.
And they mention habits.
It's security. Security.
Yeah.
Like I've had people, like I was sitting in a bar once with somebody, and this guy tells us, I mean, it was an off-color joke. It was not awful or anything, and I was laughing. And then later in the conversation, found out that I was a nun, and absolutely went nuts. Said I would have never told that joke, and I said, then you possibly shouldn't have told it to anybody.
Yeah.
I said, but I personally didn't find it offensive. In fact, I'll probably tell it to other people. So I said,
Liberal Catholicism.
I really don't have a problem with most of the things. Now, when you get down to stuff like birth control and, all those kinds of things, I go, hey, that kind of stuff's been coming down from Rome since the beginning of time, and it's only in this country that we go nutty about it, because we take law so literally here. I mean, in Rome, in Europe, they file that stuff away in a file, and they know it's there, and they think about it, they talk, but they don't scream about it from the pulpits, don't expel priests from dioceses over it.
Because, in my view, they have no trouble living their religion as hypocrites. Oh yeah, we say it, we teach it, but we don't really take it seriously.
I mean, most places in Europe, except the Eastern Bloc, which we have to remember is at least 40 years behind history because of the communist stuff, most places in Europe, the priests will talk about birth control from a pulpit. They don't get in trouble here. They go nuts. Now they've got a pope in there who's from the Eastern Bloc, who's 40 years behind in all of the philosophy and psychology and medicine and science and everything else. I could not be a happy non-Christian because I do believe in Jesus. I don't have a problem with non-Christians. I have no problem that they don't believe in Jesus. I mean, that's... And I don't think that they're not saved because they don't believe in Jesus. But neither does Vatican II anymore. Thank you, Jesus.
Yeah, John.
I know. See, I'm real. I've had conversations like this with other people, and I'm difficult to pin because I really do free float. I'm not bothered by anybody's beliefs as long as they're not imposed on me, and I don't try to impose mine on others. I mean, like I would never teach a class with all my free-flowing stuff. I give people all the church stuff, and I talk about the philosophies, and I talk about the difference in the development of Roman Catholicism since we encountered the Greeks, and I do that. But I never push my philosophies and ideologies off on other people. If they want to pick up and go with something, that's fine. But
church history.
And being Catholic is not necessarily one either that adheres to all the policies and ideas.
no, there's room for dissent in the church. There always has been.
Well, there wasn't too much room for the Inquisition. They didn't.
Oh, of course not, but there wasn't, I mean, you can translate that into secular history too. There wasn't much room for freedom for a black person in this country.
Yeah, but saying there were moral atrocities committed in secular history also is no defense for the ones committed by a supposedly divinely guided church. Sister Helen went on to suggest that the church's guilt is mitigated by the fact that some church people back then were against the Inquisition. I say whether 99% or 1% of the clergy were either for or against the Inquisition is irrelevant. The point is that the official church position, under the direction of the Pope, supported the Inquisition.
No, it was wrong. I mean, it was absolutely wrong. But, again, in the world at the same time, the church always sits in the world, and it reflects what's done in the world. And while that was happening in the church, the same kind of torture and god-awful things were happening in political and social world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the tragedy is that the church sold its soul and adapted that.
Mm-hmm.
Those processes, procedures, tortures, and all that god-awful stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not excusing them at all, because it was awful, but they did it.
But there's a definite limit to how and to what extent the church is guided by God. I mean,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the church has turned its head. I think the church is absolutely, in its humanness, turned its back on God. A lot in its history. A lot in its history. And to me, that's proof that there is God there, because eventually it does come around, but usually late and out of breath.
If I were younger, say college age, I would think Sister Helen makes an appealing case for liberal Catholicism. Why, yeah, here it is. This is how to make sense of Catholicism. You interpret things in a more sophisticated way. Moral teachings are not simplistic and absolute. They can vary tremendously at the practical level, from the theoretical principles that the Church teaches. Cultural context makes a big difference. You accept the Church's authority on doctrinal matters, but on moral issues there's room for debate, dissent, and change. Despite Catholicism's checkered history, there is an overarching divine spark and thrust to the whole enterprise. The Church and Jesus reflect God's basic intent for us. Sounds good. Sounds intellectually feasible. But I don't think it is. At the crux of issues, at pivotal points, the liberal Catholic will simply gloss over scriptural passages that refute his whole line of liberal thinking. Example. Sister Helen says that she certainly doesn't think that non-Christians are damned, but the Bible clearly says they are. Jesus says in John 3:18 that those who do not believe are condemned. How could the language be any plainer? How can you claim that what it says is not what it means? Then what the heck does it mean? The opposite? Anything you want? How can you say it means up when it says down? How can you say Jesus is expressing love and inclusivity when the words clearly express condemnation and exclusivity? Oh. You claim that Jesus himself did not necessarily say those words, and that it's more likely that the writer is saying that. He's pushing his own particular attitude and agenda, given the socio-political setting of his time. Well, in that case, Jesus must have been an extraordinarily poor communicator to not get such an important issue across clearly. He relentlessly preached tolerance, yet his spokesmen are preaching intolerance in his name? How strange. What kind of divine guidance, other than utterly useless divine guidance, can it be that leads a biblical writer to put words into the mouth of Jesus that express the exact opposite of what you claim Jesus actually preached? Sister Helen accepts the infallibly taught doctrine of the Church that Mary was assumed bodily into heaven, but she doesn't take it literally. Bodily means literally. She's just ignoring what it says. She claims she doesn't have to accept anything the Church says as absolute, except the very rare infallible pronouncements, and then she turns around and says, in effect, she doesn't have to believe in those either. I think one of the most insidious deceptions liberal Christians practice is their use of the word literal. They try to bypass all sorts of problems by claiming, oh, I don't take it literally, when in fact what they are doing is not taking seriously the underlying meaning and intent of a church teaching or scriptural passage. Excuse my language, but say somebody calls somebody else an asshole and then apologizes by saying, oh, I didn't mean it literally. Well, of course you didn't mean it literally. That doesn't mean you did not intend to say something derogatory. You're trying to deny the intrinsic meaning of what you said by pretending it's an issue of literal versus figurative language when it is not an issue of literal versus figurative language at all. You're deliberately ignoring the intended meaning of the language, deliberately ignoring the underlying meaning to which the figurative language points. Likewise, liberal Catholics try to gloss over the intended meaning of so many problematic church teachings by saying, oh, I don't take it literally. Sister Helen thinks American Catholics take the birth control prohibition too literally. But it's not a question of literal versus figurative. It's a question of intended meaning. You can't legitimately discount an important moral teaching by claiming you don't take it literally. And if by literal you mean not literally versus figuratively, but literally in the sense of something always being wrong, then what you are really doing is changing the intended teaching, the intended principle, from wrong, except in some rare cases, to not really wrong in virtually any case. It's just an ideal we hold up. To me, that's hypocrisy. Now, don't conclude that I regard liberal Christians as a menace to society. Far from it. I like Sister Helen, and I don't doubt she does a lot of good for a lot of people. I think liberal Christianity is actually a force for good. But my opinion is that intellectually, liberal Christianity is not an authentic belief system. I think the liberal Catholic boat floats on a sea of rationalizations and criminally loose interpretations of both Scripture and church teachings. I think believing in a general God, not tied to any particular religion, is what makes the most sense.